Well, guys, in January of 2021, Joe Biden hobbled into the White House and declared war on gun owners all across America, and especially in red states. And that attack has not ended to this day. And so for state lawmakers across the country, the question was, what can we do in our states to defang or blunt the impact of Joe Biden's war on gun owners? And a lot of states now have been turning to the Second Amendment Preservation Act, or SAPA for short, as a pushback and as a defense against Biden's tyranny. And we're joined today with two of the guys the two guys who made this happen in Missouri, Representative Jared Taylor and Senator Eric Burleson. And these are the two guys that did this in Missouri. And as you're about to hear, what they did in Missouri, it wasn't just another version of SAPA. It is the gold standard. It is the best in America, and it is the roadmap for all kinds of other red states across the country. So thank you guys very much for your time today and helping to explain this from your perspective as the guys who led the fight and got the arrows in the chest and the back in Jefferson City last year. So again, thank you for your time. Just kick it off, one of you guys. There's a lot of labels about SAPA. There's a lot of people that claim they passed SAPA. There's a lot of states that kind of pretend they've enacted SAPA, but you guys did it. So just break it down for us. What is the SAPA law you guys passed in Missouri last year?
Go for it.
Okay, well, in short, it's the Second Amendment Preservation Act. It's an acronym for that. And the idea is that the Constitution clearly states that when it comes to our rights to bear arms, that they shall not be infringed, period, by the federal government. And so we as a state view it that it's not at all the responsibility of the federal government. And if they want to pass unconstitutional gun grabs or anything else, that we ultimately in the states have the right to decide what we're going to enforce and what we're not going to enforce. And in Missouri, we took a stand and said that we will not spend one dime of our resources enforcing these unconstitutional gun grabs. And this is not new in the history of the United States. It's not a new concept. In fact, when you hear states talk about legalizing, quote unquote, legalizing marijuana laws or having sanctuary cities, this is what the left, or in some cases libertarians, have done to in order to not necessarily eliminate federal law, but certainly neuter the enforcement of federal laws when it comes to how they're enforced in the states. And so that's what we did with SAPA.
Yeah, I'd say in Missouri, and across the country, the way that the feds enforce federal laws, specifically when it relates to the Second Amendment, is they commandeer, they use Missouri's resources, Missouri law enforcement, to do their bidding. They do the work for the feds. And so what we did is we just said, look, you're not going to use our resources to enforce federal gun laws. We're drawing a line in the sand. If you are not a law-abiding citizen in Missouri, you can rest assured that Missouri law enforcement will not enforce whatever Joe Biden's flavor of the day gun control is going to be. We are not going to use our resources to do their work.
So a bunch of states have what they call SAPA, and it sounds like that on the outside. But the difference, I think, what you guys did, and this is what makes Missouri the best in the country right now, is you can pass this. And I think you guys are the ones that said Kansas City, St. Louis, Columbia, these cities are going to disregard this. They're going to violate the law, and they're going to trample on gun rights anyway. So what you guys did, what makes Missouri so powerful, is the civil enforcement teeth. Talk about the teeth you put into Missouri's SAPA law.
So what we are seeing happen right now on an unprecedented level is that Congress doesn't pass a bill and then we just automatically, use resources to uphold it. They use the purse. They use taxpayer money against their own taxpayers. So they take our taxpayers' dollars and then they will create programs and grants and you name it in order to entice states with money or political subdivisions, including our local law enforcement, with money that they can get if they will only cooperate, they will only participate, and they will only basically be do the dirty work of the federal government. And so in order to stop that, you have to counter that money. You have to make it clear that it's not only illegal to participate, but there's got to be some kind of enforcement mechanism and a financial cost to the local law enforcement. Otherwise, they will be enticed by the almighty dollar. And that's what we did with SAPA.
Yeah,
So the size of your teeth. Yeah, go ahead, Jared. What kind of teeth do you guys have in this?
Yeah, so it's $50,000 per offense. So if local law enforcement enforces federal gun laws, an individual can file suit civilly to stop that action from taking place. And if they're victorious, they can win up to $50,000 and attorney's fees.
And to be clear, you're talking about these civil cases are going against the department, or is it against the officers individually?
No, it's against the department. So originally, the version that we'd originally filed was against the individual officer. After working with law enforcement, talking it over with fellow legislators, we changed that burden to be on the department and not on the individual officer.
So in proposing this legislation to other legislators in different states across the country, and I know we've already brushed up on this subject. I think it probably bears going back and repeating, but there's kind of a mental hurdle for a lot of legislators to get over. They sit there and they think to themselves, this has to be like that Firearms Freedom Act legislation. How is this not nullification? And when you present this to people, they're like, oh, this is nullification. It's not going to pass a court challenge. Can you just go back and slowly go through that again? Because that's a real sticking point for legislators who are very well intended, but they maybe they're getting bad advice from other people.
So we're not trying to set up a new challenge, and we're not trying to undo the federal law. So the federal law stays in place, just like how states have quote unquote legalized marijuana. It's still illegal. And if the feds want to come in and enforce it in a law in Missouri, whether it's marijuana or they want to enforce some unconstitutional gun grab in Missouri, if they have the resources and they want to do it, then that's their prerogative. But we will not dedicate one of our resources to enforce an unconstitutional gun grab. And I'll go back to the teeth of the enforcement. It's critical that you have teeth in some way because, for example, Missouri made civil asset forfeiture illegal. Okay. And for those that are not familiar, civil asset forfeiture is when law enforcement pulls someone over and they basically will seize assets and you have to prove that the cash that they seized or the car was lawfully gained legally. Missouri, we've made it illegal to do that and for law enforcement to financially benefit. So what they did was they got around Missouri's laws by working with the federal government. So they create task forces, then they do civil asset forfeiture within those federal task forces, and then they get the bulwark of all of what they seized to their own agency, thus circumventing Missouri law. So we've seen what they've done before, and we don't want them to circumvent us here. And I'm telling you, while you may have a great sheriff in your area and you may have great police chief in your area, it doesn't mean that in the 500 other counties, like in Missouri, we have 500 plus political subdivisions. You can't tell me that every one of them is going to be a saint. So we have to write our laws to protect the citizens from everyone that might be willing to take away their rights.
And I'll talk a little bit about the Supremacy Clause. So this does not violate the Supremacy Clause in any way. We are not telling the feds what they can and can't do. We are telling our law enforcement in the state of Missouri what they can and can't do. The feds can still come in and enforce their laws, but our law enforcement will not help in enforcing federal law. And the reason that's important is because the feds use our resources to do their work. they do not have the resources. They do not have enough resources to come into the state of Missouri and enforce federal law. That's why it's such a big deal. And that's why they're taking us to court over this, is because they know that Missouri is now going to be the example, and they do not have the resources to come in and enforce federal law. They have to rely on Missouri law enforcement. And we literally just swept the rug out from underneath of them.
Darn right. So if I'm hearing you guys correctly, what you're saying is that, again, we're not telling the feds what they can do in Missouri. We're saying we're not going to help you do it. And if I'm hearing you right, what you're also saying is that the more states that enact this identical legislation, it dilutes the power of Uncle Joe that much more, because right now, well, they might put more manpower into Missouri, perhaps as a response to what you guys have done in Jefferson City. If a bunch of other red states around the country begin to adopt SAPA law, the entire weight of their program kind of falls under its own volition.
Yeah,
Exactly.
and this is politics too, because this is going to go to the Supreme Court, and Joe Biden has sued the state of Missouri. It's making it. Maybe I'm getting ahead of this on you guys' questions.
No, it's fine. Go ahead.
This is making its way up through the court system, and the more states that have joined Missouri, the more that the court will likely, I think, side with the state of Missouri. Because while you don't want to say that the court takes political sides, it would be a whole lot easier for the court to side with the Justice Department if the only state that's impacted is little old Missouri. But if other states have joined Missouri, then it's really telling the courts that this is something that the nation is paying attention to.
Right. And,
So
this is founded on a principle known as the anti-commandeering doctrine that has been upheld by the Supreme Court on numerous occasions for decades, if not, a century. But it's the idea that the feds cannot commandeer our resources. As Eric was mentioning earlier, we've seen this from the left on sanctuary cities, on marijuana legalization. Those states are just telling the feds, hey, look, we're not going to enforce federal law when it comes to marijuana. We're not going to enforce the federal law when it comes to illegal immigration. Those are still illegal, and the feds can enforce those. And just like what they did, we're doing the same thing in Missouri. It has been upheld multiple times, just that we are using this, again, anti-commandeering, that they are not going to come in and commandeer our resources and be used against something that the citizens in Missouri believe is wrong.
To touch on that.
Go ahead.
To touch on that. So to give a little bit of the history directly, is that the first case happened in 1842. It was called Prigg versus Pennsylvania. And that was a situation where Congress had passed the Fugitive Slave Act. It required other states to enforce what was really a disgusting law, where they would enforce and help round up fugitive slaves and return them to the states that they came from. The state of Pennsylvania objected, and they should have, and the courts went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the court ruled in favor of the state of Pennsylvania and said you cannot force Pennsylvania to enforce federal law. And there have been multiple decisions like that, but one that really touches upon the Second Amendment is Mack Prince versus the United States, where Sheriffs Jay Prince and Richard Mack sued the federal government, saying they were not going to administer the background check provisions of the Brady Act, and that they weren't going to participate in that. And the courts ruled in favor of those sheriffs, saying that the federal government cannot force local law enforcement to be the ones that carry out the federal laws.
I think that after the Supremacy Clause question, the one that we get the most here at the American Firearms Association, and you mentioned it briefly, Jared, it is that where is it in the courts? Because so many guys, so many gals want to file it, want to vote for it, but they're all just terrified they're going to have it struck down, by an activist judge. And on the one hand, you can't prevent an activist judge from striking down a good law, so we wouldn't want them to wait because they're waiting for more court decisions out of Missouri. But you guys have had quite a few. Is that correct? You first had a state circuit court question or decision last fall that was granted in your favor. And then if I'm correct, in February of this year, your state Supreme Court heard a challenge on that decision, and they upheld SAPA on its merits, sent it back down to the local court for some procedural cleanup questions. And then because the DOJ keeps losing in Missouri courts, they filed a new federal lawsuit. And the four of us were all there together in Kansas City in July. And as of right now, we have not heard back yet from that federal judge. But if I have this correct, you have multiple cases, multiple decisions from courts in Missouri, and they have upheld SAPA to this point so far. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, so for those who want to know, that's a big issue. And I guess what's delightful about this from the sarcastic standpoint is we had an activist judge in Kansas City. Again, we were there. We could tell that that judge is looking for a reason.
Obama appointed judge.
Exactly, to overturn this. But what's so amazing about this right now is they're in a bind because of what you guys did. Because this judge can now choose to uphold SAPA, and the DOJ can cut their losses and say, fine, Missouri's a bunch of gun people, we'll let it go. Or he can vacate it and it goes to the 8th Circuit, in which case we have a lot higher chance of winning. And heaven's sakes, if they were to strike it down, it could get in front of the Supreme Court, and then we have national binding precedent. So I'm just asking you guys, if you're a lawmaker in different states right now, based on what you've seen in the courts, it's time to go full throttle ahead, or what's your guys' advice to them from the court's perspective?
Yeah, I think go full throttle ahead. We I think with the makeup of the Supreme Court right now is the perfect opportunity to establish states' rights even more than what has been established over the last couple months. I think it's in our favor, not only like I said, the makeup that we have, but also because of the precedent that we have on all these other cases on the anti-commandeering doctrine.
Yeah. If you don't have anything else to add to that, Eric, I had one question. Whenever you pass gun rights legislation, whether it's constitutional carry or stand your ground or something like this, of course, the radical left, the media, the fake news media, we know how they're going to react. But the question I have for you guys, since a lot of people that are going to be seeing this later on are potential legislators considering sponsoring this, talk a little bit about caucus intrigue. And also, within Republican caucuses, you have like staunch, like gun nuts like us. You have like the people who just they're there on business or whatever. And then how does this play to your caucus, number one? But then number two, as we've seen with all these other gun rights issues, there's quite often law enforcement opposition because they want to keep that power. How did you guys handle that? What are some of the things that you did to deal with those issues within your caucus in particular? Because that's one of the big things, right? You'll have a bunch of law enforcement agencies sending their lobbyists and talking to these other legislators saying that they oppose it. How do you deal with that? What's the response?
Yeah, that was a lot, but you're right.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
You're right. So what the dirty secret is that people assume that there's a few. One, they assume that all Republicans want to pass gun laws or repeal gun laws, and they don't. They will run on the issue, but it becomes difficult when they actually try to do it. And then two, the other dirty secret is that the people assume that their law enforcement wants them to be law enforcement is pro Second Amendment, and they're not. Deep down, they're not. Every bill that I have ever worked on, from the year 2008 when I was first elected until today, I can't think of a single year where law enforcement didn't behind the scenes work against a bill that strengthened gun rights.
Yeah.
And it's in there. Look, rank and file law enforcement is supportive of the Second Amendment.
Yes.
But the political dynamic and the political power of the people that consolidate and who are actively working in the Capitol building on behalf of law enforcement, the lobbyists that are in the building, it's in their interest to take advantage of an item like a gun bill and to get something out of it. Because otherwise, And so that's what they often do. I mean, not often, every time. Every time they will use the vehicle of a Second Amendment bill as a way to get what they want. And it's sad, but that's been my experience. The other thing is it's in their nature to not give up control. So when you take away for example, in Missouri, I remember you used to have to go get permission from your sheriff before you could even go purchase a handgun.
Oh, really?
Yeah. We eliminated that a long time ago. Then we created concealed carry permits, and then we created constitutional carry. Well, if you think about it, constitutional carry, you're taking away the local sheriff's ability to have some discretion, right, to be able to do the background check first and get some money when they're doing it. So that was a cash cow for a lot of sheriff's offices, those concealed carry permits. And that was money that didn't go through the normal tax process. That was, a lot of it was discretionary money.
Yeah.
So they did not like a bill like that. And they certainly don't like SAPA because they want to have full access to federal grants. They don't want us to tell them no. And they will often say, we don't need this law. I won't do it. If they ask me to do something that violates people's Second Amendment rights, I won't do it. Well, the question is, you might trust that sheriff and you might have a great sheriff or a great police chief today, but it doesn't mean that you will tomorrow, or it doesn't mean that every police chief and every sheriff in the state is a saint. So,
yeah. And for those of you legislators who are watching this video at some point down the road, you can take any state in the country and you can think of an example of where this is the case. I think everybody watching this video in the future will know the truth of what Eric just said there. So keep on going.
It's sad, but what I found is the way that you pass Second Amendment legislation is you have to shed light. If you shed light in every step of the process, then it becomes difficult for people in those dark crevices of the process to try to kill a bill. Because as you guys know, there's a lot of ways to kill a bill and there's a lot of pitfalls. But if you shed light in every one of those pitfalls, and it puts pressure on the members of your own body. And yes, they may curse you under their breath, but it's the only way to get a bill from point A all the way to the end. And what that means is you have to work with groups like Missouri Firearms Coalition or the American Firearms Association. You have to work with, you have to basically be on social media. You have to get the grassroots amped and involved. In Missouri, we used not only our Second Amendment groups, we had groups like the Missouri Republican Assembly, which is considered an activist grassroots network. We had other grassroots groups that were heavily focused on this bill so that it became like a hot potato. And it was so hot that emails were blasting every step of the way. So if a committee chair who didn't like SAPA got the bill, they knew that if that bill died in their committee, no one would let them off, and everyone would blame that committee chair. And that's the place you've got to get people at. You've got to get your colleagues to that point. And it doesn't mean that I, as a state senator, was rude to my colleagues, or that Representative Jared Taylor was rude to his colleagues. You just have to let people let them know, hey, the facts are going to be the facts, and you can either help us get this done, or you can be an obstacle, and you're the one that's going to bear the brunt of it, or you're going to get the glory of it.
Yeah, I'm glad you touched on that too, about the outside groups. We as gun rights organizations obviously support something like this because of the direct benefits that we can see as Joe Biden is trying to ram his gun control agenda down our throats. But one of the things that we've been able to successfully do is get other groups on different issues involved, because they can see if we can get the SAPA bill passed, which has these massive protections in it, by kind of breaking that connection there. It has definite benefits on a whole variety of issues for that state going forward. Once those other groups could figure that out, it was a lot easier for us as outside organizations to get them engaged in the fight too. So thanks for bringing that up.
And I wanted to touch on the law enforcement thing with you, Jared, for a moment, because you guys did some very careful work on how you. on the one hand, what you're saying, Eric, is that at the end of the day, these guys, because of the power issues and the money, the department heads will just simply not agree. The frontline officers, they love SAPA because it protects them from having to enforce an unconstitutional mandate. But you guys went beyond that too, with some careful work on how you allowed for aid to be given to the federal government in limited cases, because nobody here is trying to aid a guy hauling a mule hauling a pickup load of fentanyl from Mexico up into Chicago. We're not trying to make it easier for a murderer to hang out at a flop house in St. Louis. And so you guys created some very carefully nuanced areas where local law enforcement can help the feds. And I think for lawmakers watching this down the road, these are very important as it relates to working with law enforcement. Tell us what that process was about and how it ended up when it was all said and done, Jared.
Yeah, I mean, so we worked with law enforcement. We sat down with law enforcement before session started, long before session started, probably about 2 years before we really started working on the fight in session. Sat down with law enforcement. Our door was always open to them, but we always we always had a goal in mind, which was to protect Second Amendment rights. And Eric and I both agreed that if it ever came to the point where someone put an amendment on the bill that was detrimental, that was something that we both didn't agree with, that we would kill the bill ourselves, because we didn't want bad legislation. The worst thing that could happen is if we passed SAPA that was bad, that didn't do.
Stop. You got to back up and say it again, man, because there are so many lawmakers who were talking to us, even in 2021, who were trying to pass bad SAPA. Please just say it again. You guys are willing to kill your own bill if it got weak. Say it again. I'm sorry. I had to cut you off. I apologize.
Eric and I worked together, and we decided that if something was included in SAPA that we disagreed with, that made it a bad bill, that weakened it, that didn't do what we intended for it to do, that we would be willing to kill the bill. We talked about that multiple times, because there was threats that was coming every single day. Someone new would come, oh, here, I've got a new idea that would basically gut the entire bill by changing just a few words. And so
flag laws to it or something like that, right?
Yeah.
They tried to add red flag laws to it. But yeah, to your point, they tried to weaken it. But the position that we got ourselves in was that once leadership was so sick and tired of hearing from the grassroots, they had made their decision that this has to pass, that they had to get it done and off their plate because it became such a hot potato. And at that point, then they're coming to us saying, what were you guys really willing to compromise? And at that point, you shouldn't have to compromise. Why are you letting Republicans water down your bill? Why? And so once they're committed to getting the bill passed, you've won.
Yeah.
You don't have to compromise the bill to get it done. And that's the position that we were at. And they certainly did try to make us compromise and try to get us to take some of the Democrat positions or weaken the bill, weaken the penalties in some way. But Jared, I think you were going to the way in which we were able to work with law enforcement and thread the needle of how it applies in Missouri so that we don't have a weak bill. We have a strong bill, but yet we worked with law enforcement.
Yeah, talk about three things, Jared, who it applies to, and then specifically the issue about material aid and when it can be given and how it can be given in limited circumstances.
Yes.
Sure. So after working with law enforcement, talking with them, spending hours on what their real concerns were, because like Eric said earlier, we really had to shed the light on some of these different areas where, they said that they had a concern with, but when we actually dug down deep, there were only really a couple areas that we had to address. One of them was, what if it's a really bad guy? We want to make sure that we can put the bad guy away for a long time. Well, we made the decision that it's only going to apply to law-abiding citizens. So SAPA only applies to law-abiding citizens. If you are a felon, if you have been convicted of a felony in the state of Missouri, you are no longer a law-abiding citizen. You unfortunately forfeited that right, and you've committed a violent felony. So you are no longer under the protections of SAPA. The other thing that we did was we said that we're going to give support if something, let's say law enforcement, federal law enforcement goes in and it is enforcing a warrant, and they get into a situation where there's a shootout or something and someone's injured, then of course law enforcement can go in and they can help them. We also said that if you are not from the state of Missouri, SAPA does not apply to you, because if you're fleeing another state because you're a felon or you're being convicted or being charged as a felony, then we're not going to protect those individuals either. Missouri's not going to become a sanctuary state for all these other states where criminals are fleeing to.
Right.
And so those are the areas that we really focused on. And as Eric mentioned, we had a couple areas. So specifically, if you attempted to have a violent criminal past, then SAPA would not apply to you. If you're a drug user or a drug dealer, SAPA would not apply to you. So there were very specific areas that we made sure, and we were very careful in crafting it, because what we didn't want to look like is, that we were just giving in, because that's not what we were doing.
Yeah, one of the states that we're like basically hinging or contrasting Missouri's SAPA law to is New Hampshire. And this year in New Hampshire, they used almost the identical language of Missouri's SAPA law, but one of the amendments that came in at the last minute said that it does not apply to anybody who commits any sort of a crime in New Hampshire, and that passed. So now if you're a speeder in New Hampshire, you've lost the right to have SAPA protections. They got played. And so I think to be really clear, what you guys did in Missouri is, if there is an underlying Missouri law that's being broken, if it applies to felony drug distribution cases or felony persons crimes, material aid can be given. And so it's in cases where there's an underlying law that's being broken. And again, it's that guy hauling fentanyl, like we said, from Mexico to Chicago. It's that murder suspect who's holed up in an apartment in St. Louis. If there's an underlying crime, and if it only applies to those limited cases, and you even went so far as to say, and the firearm is ancillary to the case. Is that correct? So if the fentanyl guy has an AK under the driver's seat, that's fine. The purpose was to stop a guy who was trying to deliver fentanyl, not to go after the gun he had in his vehicle. Am I wrapping my head around the material aid you still allowed to be given?
Yeah, correct. So let's say that's a perfect example. So let's say Joe Biden has his wish granted and AR-15s are illegal tomorrow. What we didn't want was for them to be able to use law enforcement resources to go in after, me and say, well, we're going in because we think he has drugs. But the real reason was because the AR-15. Well, that wouldn't be ancillary. That would be the purpose for, the warrant or executing the warrant. And so we wanted to make sure that the gun was secondary to whatever they were actually going in for.
Right, exactly. So go ahead, Chris. You have your question.
I was just going to say, so if another question that we're going to get all the time, and I think you guys have already handled it, but if you could just say it straight up, this does not eliminate joint task forces completely in absolution, because what we've seen in some places, you'll have chiefs of police or something like that, very politically motivated law enforcement, people who have long since left the beat cop duty, and they'll sit there and literally say to the legislators themselves or the committees, yeah, this removes our ability to work with our local or our federal law enforcement partners in any way. This doesn't do that? No,
not in any way. They just cannot. If anything, it focuses our local law enforcement on Missouri law. It makes Missouri law the main focal point, and they're worried. They should be. We pay their salary.
Yes.
They're not the employees of the federal government. They're the county's employees, the city's employees, the state's employees, and their job is to know the laws of the state and to enforce those laws. And if they are not enforcing those laws, then what are they doing in this task force?
Yeah. And
they're being
why have a state legislature if we're just going to be, enforcing federal law all the way down to the local law enforcement level? So
if we're just going to let the people that we hire all these law enforcement to enforce murders in our state, right? And God knows we have too many of those. So if they're going to be commandeered to go enforce some stupid gun grab, then we're not going to let that happen in Missouri. So that's the idea. And our local law enforcement, if they want to participate in a task force and they want to draw down some federal dollars, that task force better be focused on Missouri laws. It better be illegal in Missouri.
Yeah, and one other thing that I want to point out that Eric just highlighted that we put in our bill specifically was saying that nothing in the bill prevents the feds from helping Missouri law enforcement enforce Missouri law.
Yep.
So if they want to use, the NIBIN, that's a perfect example where we hear all the time, they can use that to enforce Missouri laws. And that was a critical component that we added over in the Senate that Eric added.
Yeah. So whenever people start debating you, if you're another legislator in another state, and they say, "Oh, this is going to let criminals do more murder. This is going to do drugs," the immediate question is it illegal in Arkansas? Is it legal in Arkansas to commit murder? Is it legal in Arkansas? Is it legal? Because if it's illegal in this state, then it's illegal. Period. That's the only things you should be worried about is what's legal in our state and what's illegal in our state.
And so just to Jared, to pick up on that point one more time. So they are allowed to ask for any local cops can ask for any and all help from the federal government, fingerprint analysis, ballistic analysis, tracking, people's identities through different states. They can ask for all of that help even after you guys pass SAPA. We're just not going to give help in reciprocal help to the federal government to enforce gun control. Am I hearing that crystal clear?
That's exactly right. Yep.
Unless
Nora O'Donnell didn't believe you guys. I saw her on 60 Minutes, and I don't think she believed you. So
unless that citizen has also violated a state law.
Right.
So
exactly.
to be clear, we go a further step. They can help us enforce our law, but if that citizen has violated a state law, then SAPA provides no protections to that person whatsoever. They can be prosecuted federally and or in state courts.
Excellent. A couple more questions I needed to ask you guys. We're hearing this as another a cop-out, frankly, from legislators in different states. They want to do a SAPA resolution. And for anybody who's watching right now who might be new in politics, I'm not sure what that means. We're talking about kind of that token gesture that says, whereas, therefore we declare something. Nebraska did this last year. 3 weeks after you guys passed SAPA law, Nebraska does a SAPA resolution. Just touch on that for a moment, Jared or Eric, about you guys did a law here. It actually has teeth. We're not doing some meaningless resolution.
Yeah, resolution has no weight. There's nothing behind it holding it up. It's no better than this piece of paper right here. It's worth nothing. You have to put it in statute, and you have to have the enforcement mechanism. And to be clear, you can't have someone else. You can't allow someone else to file the charges or to file the civil suit. You have to give that right to the individual. It can't be an attorney general who does it. It can't be a local prosecutor, because those people are not going to go against their law enforcement. The chief law enforcement officer, the AG in each state, is not going to go against the law enforcement officer in their state for violating SAPA. You have to give that right to the individual to file that civil suit and to go against them against the department. That's what's critical for SAPA. That's why Missouri works. That's why we're being sued by the feds, because our SAPA is working.
So I want to drill down on that point again, because there's a lot of confusion out there. On the one hand, there's the resolution approach, the very, 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 that's a do nothing approach. On the flip side, then you have some activists, you have some legislators, and you have some folks who are trying to maliciously use SAPA to protect their own careers, who are going the opposite direction, where you touched on, Jared, which is criminal charges. They say, Missouri, that's weak because that's just civil charges. We're going to do criminal charges. I'll use example. Wyoming this year enacted what they called SAPA law, and it gutted the civil enforcement. It gutted the teeth. It allows for all the task forces to continue. And then instead, they insert a criminal penalty phase in this legislation. So from some people, that might sound really aggressive. We're trying to really send a message.
Make it a crime.
But what you touched on, I think, is the exact point. Using, again, Wyoming as the example, if somebody alleges a SAPA violation, it goes to the state AG. If the AG concurs, she may tell the governor. If the governor wants to investigate it, he may. And if he concurs, he may tell local law enforcement, we will not enforce that law here in our state. At the end of the day, you got about 5 ifs and mays, and it's never going to be enforced. And if it is, as you said, Jared, you're trusting your county prosecutor to bring a criminal charge against the county sheriff. Tell me how unlikely that is and actually happening.
Yeah, it's impossible. It's never going to happen.
Yeah,
exactly. Well,
yeah. We have in Missouri, we have the problem today. We had Kim Gardner use her discretion to decide that she was going to file charges against the McCloskey family, the husband and wife who were defending their backyard.
Oh, yes.
A mob break-in. So she chose to enforce she twisted a piece of statutes to enforce something against them. But the same prosecutor refuses to enforce murders that occur in her own county. And so we have activist prosecutors, and the citizens have no recourse in that scenario. That's why you don't want to leave it up to a prosecutor to decide whether or not someone should have their rights taken away or not.
And I think when we were all in federal court, I think the federal court judge and the DOJ's lawyer's response is all the proof anybody needs. The federal judge says, or he asks, is there anybody else, any other states where the DOJ is suing to block SAPA? And the DOJ's 10-person team, which was flown in there from DC, says, no, only Missouri causes the DOJ any problems right now because of the teeth that you guys built into the law. It was great to be sitting there by you guys because, you're the guys that did it, and the DOJ is just seething that they've lost an element of control. And what you mentioned, Jared, is correct half an hour ago. If this is upheld, even if it's not upheld, as it goes up to the appellate process, this is the roadmap that red states can use across the country. That is what terrifies Joe Biden, and that is what terrifies the DOJ. And for guys and gals who are in state legislative bodies right now, I think SAPA is the most important tool that you guys have to work with today. I guess one last question I had, I think we mentioned this a minute ago briefly, but you're seeing already with this resurgence of the 10th Amendment and this resurgence of the anti-commandeering doctrine, other states not just using this idea on gun rights, but a whole host of issues where we can reassert state authority. It's a phenomenal tool, not even just in the area of gun rights.
Yeah, we're seeing it across the board where states are starting to use this idea in other areas. Education, there's other areas that this is, like you said, a roadmap to what we can do to push back against the feds. We all know that the feds in all areas are encroaching on states' rights. And again, using the power of that purse, using grants and using all these other tools to entice states to give in and to give up. And this is a way that we push back.
Well, thank you for answering that, because you'd be surprised at how many state representatives that I've sat down and started a conversation out with. When I asked them the question, what does dual sovereignty in government in America mean to you? They literally have no idea that our system of government was created with dual sovereignty, where federal government has its sovereignty and the states have their sovereignty. A lot of these legislators have no idea that exists, and the power that is available to them through this idea of the anti-commandeering doctrine. So thank you for articulating everything you guys have done. I don't have any other questions, Aaron. Do you?
No, I just want to thank both you guys. I know I was there with you in this fight, and you guys got a lot of arrows in your chest, but you got a hell of a lot of arrows in your back. And I know we were watching you guys in that fight, and thank you for what you did. It's not just about Missouri, as we said. This is a national issue now, and that's why the national media is constantly attacking you two guys. Thank you guys for leading that charge. And if we can use you guys as a resource going forward for other legislators to talk to you and ask you questions, can we reach out to you at that time and let them connect directly?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. More than happy to help.
All right. Thank you very much, guys.
We couldn't have done this without grassroots organizations like Missouri Firearms Coalition. There's no way that we would have been able to accomplish this. There's just absolutely no way.
Yeah. So if you are a legislator and you are watching this at some point down the road, that is what these organizations will also assist with, is making sure that the grassroots are making sure that the entire legislature knows that they want this legislation, that they need this legislation, and how powerful it can be in assisting the state to fight back against these encroachments on our rights from the federal level. So thanks a lot, guys. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.